Just to get warm, it would be important to remember that the earliest version of Women's Day, it's more than 1 century old. No, it was organized by the Socialist Party of America in New York City in 1909. And the idea of an international day was to celebrate and advocate for women's rights. And this idea gained momentum in a conference held in 1910, inspired by German delegates, by the way. And well, it has been since 1911 officially observed on March 8 in several countries. Younger generations, of course, me also, know that it's celebrated internationally by the United Nations and all around the world since 1977. So for us, the ZEF Gender Group, it's really a pleasure. We have joined efforts this year with our colleagues of the Bonn Center for Dependency and Slavery Studies, and are very proud of having here Professor Miriam Cooke, who was already yesterday in the first day of this marking of the International Women's Day. Yesterday, we had a workshop on Islamic feminism and dependency with the input of Professor Miriam Cooke, organized by our colleagues. I mentioned already, no, Dima, who is here, Dima Munayed, David Smith, who is also here, Emma Kalb. I don't know if she will join online. And yes, I want also just to mention that this is, as I said, an effort from the ZEF Gender Group. We are here, 3 of the 4 co-coordinators of the ZEF Gender Group. Eva is here, Sundus is here, probably Tina will also join, and myself. So very shortly, I want Purti, who is also the assistant of the group, no? Very shortly, I will just mention what we will do today in this next 2 hours and a half. After Eva gives the walking words, we will show 2 videos on Nawal El-Saadawi. Very short, one 5 minutes, the other 15. We will have a coffee break and some pictures at 2 o'clock. It's a beautiful day. We can go outside, a suggestion of Yesim, who is supporting us from our public relations office today. And then we will have the central talk of Professor Cooke on Arab feminism and politics. And we will have around 1 hour of discussion. We will be closing around 4. So having said that, I invite Eva, who is the head of the group Political and Cultural Changes, and as I mentioned, also co-coordinator of one of the co-coordinators of the ZEF Gender Group, for the welcome words. Please, Eva.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. I just came back from my trip to Barcelona, and this morning I woke up and I thought, okay, these welcome addresses are kind of challenging sometimes. But then I switched on the radio. I listened to the mainstream or the broadcaster, radio broadcaster, Deutschlandfunk, which I used to do sometimes. And yeah, and I thought, okay, this is now the entry point, and I noted it down. So on today's International Women's Day, the United Nations noted that progress towards gender equality is threatened by war and conflict. Women and children are disproportionately affected by wars and conflict, and which they did not cause. This is a rather sad reflection on this day, I have to admit, and we can witness these circumstances every day when we listen to the news about the horrific consequences of wars and conflicts around the world, in Gaza, Myanmar, Sudan, Ukraine, Afghanistan, and so on and so forth, for women and children. They are not only disproportionately affected by the long-term consequences of these wars and conflicts, they also suffer sexualized violence on an indescribable scale. Violations are being used as a weapon to achieve war goals, as we all know. At the same time, I also witnessed this morning from the reporting, and I think we all do, the cause and the content of the news in mainstream media, that double standards are being applied to assess the consequences of these wars for the affected population in general and for women and children in particular. This morning, the German media rightly discussed the crimes committed against Ukrainian women during the war that has been going on there for now quite a while, more than 2 years. However, not a word was mentioned about the suffering of women and children in the war in Gaza. They are the main victims of this war in terms of number of deaths, number of wounded, violated, and regarding the long-term consequences they have to suffer. The knowledge we produce and distribute matter about these effects or implications of war and violent conflict. And they show our Eurocentric view on the world with which we seem to divide into valuable and less valuable women, valuable and less valuable lives, valuable and less valuable feminist struggles. We want to break with these double standards and give a voice to those who are currently being silenced, at least in a couple of countries in Europe. And we want to show that the feminist struggle also exists in the Arab world, and that it is powerful, important, and necessary to fight global historical patterns of exploitation, injustice, and intolerance all over the world. The International Women's Day serves as a platform to both celebrate achievements and mobilize efforts to address persisting gender disparities and their causes. With the event today, we want to encourage reflection on the progress made through the work of Professor Miriam Cooke, who tirelessly show how Arab feminists denounce and work to transform patriarchal norms within Muslim communities and also beyond. Towards this end, we are grateful for the opportunity to collaborate today for the first time between, the ZEF Gender Group, of course, and the Bonn Center for Dependency and Slavery Studies. Our colleagues at BCDSS look at both the disadvantaging and privileging effects involved in all dimensions of social asymmetry. This year, their research area, gender and intersectionality, is setting the thematic focus for the center's activities. On its side, the ZEF Gender Group is active since January 2020, not 19, no, with the aim to strengthen gender-sensitive research at ZEF and to promote interdisciplinary collaboration on gender issues among ZEF researchers. Given these convergences of our work, we welcome this collaborative effort to bring Professor Cooke to Bonn and to the university venues to discuss relevant issues such as the intersection of gender, war, and modern Arabic literature, which was addressed yesterday, and the major threads weaving the intricate tapestry of Arab feminist thought, which is the focus of today's presentation. It is not only an academic interest that brings us all together here, but a real sense of solidarity with the multiple Arab women's voices emerging against all odds in all realms, from literature to control over their bodies to politics. As Professor Cooke remarks in her book, Women Claim Islam, feminism is an attitude, a frame of mind that highlights the role of gender in understanding the organization of society. Feminism provides analytical tools for assessing how expectations for men's and women's behavior have led to unjust situations, particularly, but not necessarily only for women. Feminism seeks justice wherever it can find it. And with this in mind, I would like to again thank you, Miriam, for accepting this invitation and to be here today and yesterday and for a while with us. I want to thank the ZEF Gender Group and the Bonn Center for Dependency and Slavery Studies, of course, the public or the PR teams of both co-organizers, all the attendees, and I wish you all a fruitful discussion. And we are looking now forward to the videos, I guess, and then to your presentation. Thank you so much.
I would like to introduce Professor Cooke. She is a Braxton Craven Professor Emerita of Arab Cultures at Duke University in North Carolina, United States of America. She serves on several international advisory boards, including academic journals and institutions. Her writings have focused on the intersection on gender and war in modern Arabic literature, Arab women's writers' constructions of Islamic feminism, and Arab cultural studies with a concentration on the Arabian Gulf and Syria. She has published 15 books and is currently working on a novel about World War II Palestine. 3 of her books, Women Claim Islam, which we have seen yesterday with more detail, Women and the War Story, and the Anatomy of an Egyptian Intellectual, Hayati, sorry if I mispronounce it. These 3 books were named Choice Outstanding Academic Books. And she has also published a novel, Hayati, My Life, in 2000. Worldwide mentioning, it's also her anthology, Arab Feminist Writings, published in 2004. And several of her books have been translated into Arabic, Chinese, Dutch, French, and German. So it's an honor for us to have you here, please, Professor Cooke.
Thank you, Denise. Where is my, is it?
Yeah.
Good. Yeah, and thanks to the 2 organizations that invited me, and particularly to Dima, with whom I've been in conversation for the past year. I thought talking now with David that I would tell you just a little. Is it okay for me to move away from the mic or no?
It's quite sensitive.
It's quite sensitive. Okay. So I'm short for this, aren't I? In 1993, early in January, I knew Noelle pretty well before that. She got in touch with me and said that she had just learned that she had been put on the death list of the Muslim Brothers, and that the government had very kindly sent guards to protect her. But she said when she saw the guards, she knew who they were. They had guarded her in prison. And so she said she was more worried about the guards than she was of the death list placement by the brothers. So I had a wonderful dean at the time, and he said, yes, bring her. And she also came with Sharif Hatata, who did most of the translations of her works. And as somebody had already mentioned in one of these videos, as a mentor, and for me, almost a kind of maternal figure, she has given me over the years immense courage to do things that I would not have been able to do had Noelle not guided me for many years. She was, in fact, at Duke a little longer. So she was there from 93 to 97 and came back often. So I will actually be talking about her a little, and so you're very well prepared. So I have to stand here, right?
No.
I can move a bit. Okay, good. I can maybe. It's okay. Here.
People don't hear anymore.
They will complain. Okay, good. As long as people aren't shy. Yes, so yesterday I was doing a workshop with, I think I recognize it, several of you were there yesterday. And so a point that I was trying to make is that when Arab or Muslim women use the term feminism, it is very, very important to them that feminism be disentangled from white feminism. So some don't like the term feminist, and something that I think is important to talk about, some of you may be familiar with this, that feminism as a term, especially when it's transliterated into other languages like Arabic, it sounds Western. And so there has been a big debate against it, a big critique of the term. I made the point yesterday that as a term, it is crucial to hold on to and not to try and find some kind of simile that will not have that power. But the issue with the term feminism is that, of course, and Gayatri Spivak, for those of you who know Gayatri Spivak's work, and Leila Ahmed, the point that they are making is that the British and the French, they came in with an agenda, and the agenda was that they were going to split the society at its most basic level, split the men from the women, say that the men are the ones who are oppressing their women, and we enlightened British and French will come in and we will save your women from you men. And so Gayatri Spivak, and some of you may be familiar with her famous axiom, saving brown women from brown men. And so that was white men in the beginning, but after the whole issue with first the Taliban and then the invasion by the Americans into Afghanistan and then into Iraq, many of us added to white men saving brown women from brown men, white men and white women saving brown women from brown men. So that's the history behind it. You know, that somebody like Craven, Lord Craven, when he came into Egypt, he was one of the great saviors. And at home, he was as fascist and patriarchal as any of the men who had come in with him in the early 20th century. So I hope that has clarified the term a little bit. I talked yesterday about feminism as being in the book that Denise mentioned and didn't have the title. It's called Opening the Gates, A Century, an Anthology of Arab Feminist Writings. The categories were awareness of gender injustice, saying no to gender injustice, and then doing something about it. So that's where the activism comes in. So feminism is not just being out in the streets and fighting whoever it is that one's fighting. It's awareness and saying no. So in what I'm going to be talking about today, I will be starting with Islamic feminism, a little different from yesterday, but bear with me for those of you who were there, and separating out secular feminism. I'm doing it kind of strategically for the talk today, and I will bring it together at the end, but I want you to be aware of the fact as I talk that the strategies used by Islamic feminists and Arab secular feminists, the strategies overlap. So crucial also when we think about Arab feminism, I know a lot of you are working with South America and Africa. So you're familiar with this notion of, for example, African feminism as being transnational. I think for many, Arab feminism or Arab as a term is not as immediately obvious as a transnational term. But of course, there are 22 countries with radically different experiences. And so there could be a question you might pose to me at the end is, so all these different conditions, historical, national, local, personal circumstances that discriminate against women, surely they're different. And of course they are. And then, of course, it's not Western feminism. So what Islamic feminism does, and Fatima had asked me yesterday, and today she came up to me and she said, but, you know, I've been working with women's organizations and we're very activist and we're very much fighting for gender justice, but how can you say Islamic feminism? You know, it's an oxymoron because Islam is patriarchal. And so, you know, you couldn't be an Islamic feminist. So I hope that I convinced some of you. So a critical issue in Islamic feminism that will be a little different from the Arab feminism I'll talk about in a minute is that it's very focused on the scriptures. And a very popular short part of a verse is La ikrah fi din. And so this is in the second surah, which is the cow, verse 256. There is no coercion in religion. And many feminists who have been critiquing men's misogynist and sometimes women's misogynist interpretations of scriptures, they start from the premise, you can't force me to do anything because there is no coercion in religion. And anyhow, in Islam, ijtihad, or the right to interpret, is individual. So unlike David, who is an intercessor between us and God, if we are Presbyterians, otherwise you're not. Unlike Christianity and Judaism that has an intercessor, in Islam, the direction between the individual and God is direct. And so many women who are who believe strongly in their faith, but are avid fighters for their rights, are insisting that they have the right to interpret the verses the way they want to. So one of the crucial issues is that outsiders have brought up, and insiders also, is a problem with gender segregation. So that, again, assumed by many men who will claim the right to interpret the Quran, is women have to be at home, they have to be covered, and yet gender segregation is mentioned only twice. The gender segregation behind some kind of, in the tribal society of the 7th century, behind some kind of curtain, tribal society. And in fact, it is only twice mentioned in connection with the women, and it is because the wives of the Prophet, who are called the mothers of the faithful, Ummahat al-Mu'minin, had to be in a special privileged place. But then, interestingly enough, the only other mention of gender segregation in connection with women is for Mary. So yes, here are the spaces of seclusion of the Virgin Mary when she seeks to learn of her, when she is learning of her virginal pregnancy. So this is also true, and I'll talk about this in a minute with the hijab. So gender segregation is both rejected by Arab feminists, but also celebrated. So in terms of the negativity, there is a poet, an American Syrian poet called Mahja Kaf. And here's a short part of a poem of hers that she calls My Little Mosque. And it's, in my little mosque, there's no room for me to pray. I am turned away faithfully 5 times a day. My little mosque, so meager in resources, yet so eager to turn away a woman. And this has been an issue since around the 70s, where women, feminists around the world, not just in the Arab world, have been demanding to be put into the main part of the mosque with the men. They can pray side by side, but this relegation either to a basement or to a balcony above men's space is something that they really reject. So, of course, for outsiders, this notion of gender segregation that is considered to be endemic in Islamic societies is something that is presented, as Delacroix did in a very beautiful way here. I mean, beautiful painting, is obviously a prison. So they're these men guarding the women. But there are also and a number of Arab feminists who have said gender segregation is not in itself a bad thing as long as it's chosen. And so if obviously this is imposed, if it's a mandate, that's a problem. But when it's not, if it's chosen, it can be empowering. So yesterday I was talking a little bit about the Saudi women who I met on a lecture tour in 1983. So going from Jeddah to Riyadh to Tehran. Although the gender segregation there isn't chosen, it is such and so widespread that you have to have women in charge of women's spaces because men can't enter them. So in that way, gender segregation can be empowering, at least at a personal level. But then there is a film that came out in 1988, Farida Ben Yazid, Moroccan woman, did this film, directed this film, Door to the Sky, Bab As-Samaa Maftuh, where she shows the way in which the heroine of the story is able to use the Quran for her benefit. And what I mean by that is that she inherits with her brother this huge palace in Fez, a beautiful big palace. And she wants to have the palace for her, for a battered women's shelter, a women's shelter. And so she uses the Quran to empower her to buy her brother's share. And over the course of this film, you see how she has a woman Quranic reciter. And in the 80s, that was difficult. Women were not supposed to recite the Quran. But of course, once they're in the segregated space. Who else is going to do it? And how women flocked to her shelter, her beautiful shelter. So the hijab, of course, a huge issue in not only in Islamic feminism, but also in secular feminism, because of the notion that the hijab shapes who you are. It's a way that I can identify who you are, and then I can tell you who you are. So in the beginning of the 20th century, but also going towards the end until the emergence of the Islamic feminist movement in the 1990s, that's where it really took off. There was a concerted fight, not only in the Arab world, but across the Muslim world, to have women remove the veil if they wanted to. And the argument that a lot of the Islamic feminists were making is the veil, the hijab was not Islamic. It's 5,000 years old, and it's a marker of class. So if you're veiled, it's like, Chinese men who grow their little finger that shows their class because they can't work. And if you're totally covered, it is very hard to work, certainly in the fields. And so there are only 7 mentions in the Quran, unlike what many of the self-appointed clerics would say, oh, it's all over the Quran and you have to cover. And of course, they're relying on women not having read the Quran, not knowing the Quran, and having to submit to these self-appointed, usually, authorities. And so the hijab is, it's like a screen, and it's used 7 times in the Quran, never to do with clothing. So in the early part of the 20th century, there were a number of, one might say, early Islamic feminists, but really at that time they were feminists. And there was a man, Qasim Amin, he was a judge, and he wrote a book in 1899. And this book, that has subsequently been criticized as being too kind of colonial in the language that it used, was the woman question. And he demanded as a judge who was versed in Islam, that women not be compelled to veil, because if they were veiled, that also meant that they should not go out into the street. That meant that they could not be educated. And what kind of a mother is an uneducated woman going to be to young men who may be the leaders of the next generation? So that's how the argument was made. So one of the earliest women was Aisha Tamuria. She wrote her autobiography. And she says in her autobiography, perhaps I'm not qualified to speak in this sphere, and I admit to my limited powers of grasping the subject at hand, self-effacing, as though she's not smart. But then she says, for I am secluded by the tent of an enveloping wrap. For those of you who, well, you'll hear it a little later. Wrap My Hijab is a rap song. Yet across the borders of this tent, this enveloping wrap, I perceive the programs of education are treasure chests. We, the assemblage of women kept in seclusion, are more knowledgeable than you in the formation of the young. Now, interestingly enough, she is the she is the mother of two of the most important Egyptian writers who then took up the feminist cause, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So here's Qasim Amin, his liberation of women. And the best known woman, and she definitely would not have considered herself an Islamic feminist, very much part of a secular movement for women's empowerment. She established in the early 20s the Egyptian Feminist Union. And in that year, 1923, she went to Rome, International Feminist Conference, women from all over the world. And she came back with a whole new sense of the way women should act, speak, and be in society. And so with her two other companions from the Egyptian Feminist Union, she said, well, when we arrive in Cairo station, how about taking off? They were wearing the yashmak, which was a white cloth that covered the nose and the face. So it caused an outcry briefly, and then unveiling spread across the world. So that, of course, was very threatening for some of these clerics, whether they were self-appointed or not. So in 4 years after Huda Sha'arawi appears in Cairo station with her two companions without her face covered, there is a fatwa from Damascus. A fatwa is a legal opinion. It is not a mandate. It's just an opinion. And there they called for the reinstatement of the veil on women. And in fact, they were like women in the streets, regardless, if you're Buddhist or Christian or Jewish, you had to cover your face. So this young woman, Nazira Zeineddine, 19-year-old Druze woman, responded to this fatwa in an unprecedented 400 pages. So imagine by 19, she knew enough. Her father was a judge in Beirut. And she writes this book, Unveiling and Veiling, a Sufur al-Hijab. And in it, she says, hijab is a choice. And that takes us back to that verse from the Quran, La ikrah fi din. There can be no coercion in religion. And she says, I can't force you to take your veil off, and you can't force me to veil. So the argument going both directions. She was then also adamant that if in a tradition, and a tradition is something that the Prophet Muhammad said or did that was witnessed by a companion, and this statement or this report of an action has passed down through an authenticated line of authorities, it then for some, has almost more validity than the Quran. And she says, of course it can't be, because many Muslims believe that God spoke through the angel Gabriel directly to Muhammad. So how can God's word be less than the report of a human word or action? Muhammad has absolutely no divine qualities. Muhammad is a man, a human. He's a perfect human, but he's not divine. And of course, the word of God for her must supersede the words of men. She also took on one of the another tradition that has been authenticated, and she said it can't be. It can't be that Muhammad said that women are lacking in religion and reason. And it is in the what are called the sound traditions, the authenticated traditions. And so she takes on that, that verse as well. So there are a number of writers I just mentioned here. One, the Egyptian Murala Tahawi, Blue Aubergine, a very powerful novel by a young woman who's actually telling her own story. Miral was pretty much inducted into the Algerian FIS, Front Islamique de Salut, and was married to one of the GIA men, one of the leaders of the military branch of the front, and one day realizes, because as we go through the novel, she is more and more covered. It starts with her brother telling her how she should dress, and then her husband, who's a leader of the GIA, of one part of the GIA, who are getting her to be totally enclosed, and then she throws it off. And the other is a Lebanese, Zeineddine, who published in 1999 a novel called The Honey. And her concern as an Islamic feminist is that women's voices have been equated with their genitalia. By that, I mean, there is a term in Arabic called awra, which means shame, and connected to genitalia. And that over the years was connected to the mouth. So the mouth, like a woman's genitalia, is something that should not be seen, definitely should not be heard. Awra rhymes with thawra, awra, shame, thawra, revolution. And there is that play with awra and thawra. So one of the most prominent early feminist, Islamic feminist, was a Moroccan, Fatima Mernissi. And look how she's dressed. She's not covered at all. In fact, she and Nawal Saadawi were very good friends. And Nawal would always complain to me after she had spent some time with Fatima. And she'd say, oh my God, she always wants to put makeup on me. So, and Nawal was quite pretty. And I did see her once with makeup, and I thought, looked great, but she didn't like that. Fatima's point is that all women have to educate themselves. They have to educate themselves so they can read texts. And I'm going to come up with this later in terms of the constitutions of the Arab Spring. The women have to be educated to know what their rights are, civically, but also in terms of hermeneutics. How can they respond to the ways in which their rights are twisted and taken from them by misogynists? So the latest stage is hijabi activism, and that is young women since 9/11, really, who have started to, as a movement, to choose to put on the veil, very much upsetting their mothers and grandmothers who spent their lives fighting against the veil as a patriarchal symbol, and saying, no, this isn't false consciousness. I want to be covered. I want the world to see that I am totally committed to my religion, and that the hijab, far from disempowering, is empowering and demands respect. Okay, so now I'm moving to what I call secular feminism, but the secular religious divide is something that many of us abhor and reject. And at the end, I will bring them together. But the reason I'm doing this is that I want you to see the extent to which the strategies and the tactics that feminists are using seem to be a little different, but in fact overlap. So violence against women has been a huge issue. And this goes back to a group of male writers. They were called the New School, the Madrasa Haditha. And two of them, the main writers, were the sons of Aisha Taimuriya, the woman that, the tent of an enveloping wrap. And so these are the issues that they picked up, things that have become so normalized that people just kind of accepted them. So there's child brides, which is obvious, but the one that I want to just for a minute spend a little time with is House of Obedience. Has anybody heard of the House of Obedience? Okay. Beit al-Ta'a was an institution that was said to be Islamic, that had no basis in the Quran at all, was when a woman wanted to get out of a marriage and she would go to the court, the judge very often would judge against her and would virtually give the keys to the husband to lock her into a room where she would be available for whatever he wanted from her. So this was pretty rampant, particularly in North Africa. And so a lot of these early feminists really took on this as obviously not Islamic, no proof of it existing in the Quran. And of course, female genital mutilation. So, wrong direction. So horrible photograph of Nawal, but so Nawal, one thing that didn't come out in both of these videos is that she was trained as a physician. She actually became head of the health ministry. And after 1972, when she started to write about female genital mutilation, she was kicked out, even though she was head of it. And so in 72, she knew whereof she spoke because she was her first place to practice. She trained in Cairo, but her first place to practice was in the town next to her village. So she came from a village, Kafr Tahla, and some of the pictures you saw of the Nile were that was exactly what her village was like, and it still is. I visited fairly often. But she would see what shape these girls were in when they would come to her, totally cut up and torn up in their vaginas. And then in 1977, she did something that nobody had done, and that was to talk about specifically what had happened to her. And so there is a pretty gruesome description of her mother taking her to actually a midwife. The midwives were doing this cutting. She takes them, she is taken to this room where a mother holds her down while her clitoris is cut. But Nawal was concerned with many, many issues of violence against women, and perhaps her best known novel, which is not a novel really, is called Woman at Point Zero, where she tells the story through the voice of a prostitute who is in prison. It's her last night before she's going to be executed in the morning. And she finally gives the psychiatrist, Nawal, permission to record her story. So this is pretty much a true story. And it's a story that the woman Firdaus means paradise. Firdaus tells Nawal the story of serial abuse until she finally gets into the hands of a pimp who abuses her so much that she kills him. And Nawal's issue is this is something that is not just Egyptian, not Arab, but in fact international. And that's a point that a lot of Arab feminists have been making, and that is the kinds of abuses that we're talking about and that we are rejecting are not limited to the Arab world. They're international. I did it again, sorry. And so she talked about her, about ALSA, but I thought it was interesting in the 1997 platform for the conference. Remember, she was talking about these regular conferences, that it is, I think, a platform for Arab feminist political thought to build up solidarity between women and men. Because her point is that women can't do it on their own. Men have to join in. So most of the meetings had quite a lot of men, especially young men. And her husband, Sharif Hayati, as I mentioned, was one of her staunchest supporters and translators. And she wants to, and also she was constantly talking about linking. So for her, intersectionality was just part of her DNA, that you have to link all of the discriminations and in a way that you can fight against them. So of course, we have years, decades, pretty much most of the 20th century, if not earlier. So of course, in 1830, Algeria was occupied by the French settler colonial project. And many of these writers are talking about the way in which women have been important participants in these anti-colonial struggles. And what became really important was that if you were a combatant and you were fighting not just for women, but you were fighting for the nation, so you're fighting for women and for men to liberate the country, the people of its oppressive foreign rule, there should be recognition for what you've done. You should at least be recognized as having the same civic rights as men. So when Frantz Fanon came to Algeria in, I think it was 59 or 60, he was really, really, really impressed with the way in which Algerian women were negotiating the Medina, so the old city, and how they were the ones who were actually transporting the bombs and the ammunition. And so he called it stratégie femme. So it was women's strategy, women's specific strategies. But Assia Jabar, the Algerian historian and novelist, a few years after independence was won in 62, and thanks really to women, she goes to where she knows some of these women combatants have moved to, and they are living in abject poverty. And so she came up with this term Algerian lesson, that women have to demand their civic rights, their whichever rights they want, at the point that they're being recognized as being effective in their country. You can't wait for the recognition afterwards. And unfortunately, as I'll say in a minute, the Algerian lesson continues to be a lesson in the Arab Spring. So here, very emblematic women's successful opposition to colonial presence was in Palestine between 1967 and 1987. So you can see these two images of women, and these are not posed. These are the way things were. Look at the Israeli with his Uzi pointed right at her heart, and the woman on the right. So what worked for Palestinian women, and this was primarily in the West Bank, was that they knew in this earlier period that international media was focused on the area. They knew that if, which happened, a tank, an Israeli tank would enter, for example, Ramallah or wherever, Nablus, in the West Bank, if a tank came and they could see it from a distance, or they saw soldiers who were fully armed in uniform, they would go out into the street with their kids and they would throw stones. And so there emerged out of this a literary genre for a while, not after 87, but before. And it was in Hebrew, Yorim v'bochim. They shoot and they cry, because these soldiers who were compelled to shoot unarmed children would go home to their mothers and they would weep, I had to kill this unarmed child. So as you can imagine, that was a pretty objectionable situation. And after 1987, and I've written about the failure of this movement that was succeeding for 20 years, the men, including Arafat, took over the women's ways of fighting, except that they militarized them. Instead of throwing stones, they threw Molotov cocktails. Instead of going out as citizens, they went out with the keffiyeh wrapped as though it was a military outfit. And so within 4 years, the Intifada collapsed. So similar situation in the Civil War in Lebanon. It was a strange civil war in that it was not between two groups or 3 or 4 groups. It was pretty much spontaneous explosions of violence where it became acceptable for men to go away. Many went to the Gulf and left women behind, because women and children behind, because they were expecting that if an apartment or a house was left empty, that all the people who were who were homeless would then go in. So there was a kind of respect, even if there was a single old lady in an apartment or a house, they would not invade. So this brings me finally to the Arab Spring, to again women's role in their societies, their countries' fight against oppression. And this is sufficiently recent that maybe you know about Yemeni Tawakkul Karman. So she then was in front of the university and she says, Ali Abdullah Saleh's days are numbered. Sisters, now is the time for women to stand up and become active without asking for permission. Women are no longer victims. They have become leaders. We want to retrieve our nation. we want to become citizens in a new world. And of course, she then got the Nobel Prize. So here's our friend Noel, absolutely delirious with joy. In fact, she was telling me that what was so surprising for her is when she went into Tahrir, there were a lot of these Muslim brothers who were in the square, and they embraced her. You know, you're our leader, and she was thrilled. And some of them came to her apartment in Shubra, which is way up the Nile from the Tahrir, and they put her, at that point, you know, she's in her 80s, they put her on the back of a motorbike and drove her into the square. So this revolution was started by Asma Mahfouz. And this was the day before the actual revolution broke out in Tahrir. She called on men in particular to come to the square, and that if you don't come to the square, you aren't men. And of course, it succeeded in 18 days, but almost immediately we see the backlash, right? So the Egyptian constitution, and friends of mine were actually on the board that drafted the constitution, feminists who were demanding women's rights. Not a single article was dealing with women's issues. And worse than that, you see that there were massive gang attacks on women. So they had to, women and men, put together organizations to protect women who were being groped, raped. And so you have like Tahrir bodyguards and Group B. And they say, if the government can't or won't protect us, we'll have to protect ourselves. Yeah, the Tunisian situation, they did much better. Again, feminists were part of the team putting together the constitution, and they did really well in the beginning. No going back. Unfortunately, they have gone back. So yes, this is kind of my summation of where I see feminists in the Arab world, but not just in the Arab world. In fact, I think there is a lot that we can learn here from what has been going on in Muslim societies, and particularly in Arab societies, because I think many of us, particularly if you look as bland as I do, people don't know how to place you. But if you are covered or you declare yourself Muslim, you know exactly how people are looking at you. So I come up with this term, multiple critique. And so in conclusion, I want to say that, and I had warned you I was going to do that I have separated religious and secular feminist resistance, but I want to emphasize that the strategies overlap. So despite the radical differences between these 22 countries, Arab feminist political thought, like all feminist thought, is concerned with injustice to women, but also to men. And so at the very end, I think, Eva, you'd mentioned about the tapestry and the threads. And I have an article that's coming out this summer that talks about weaving the multiple threads of Arab feminist political thought. And so I have 7 demands or 7 threads that weave this tapestry. So the first is to understand how mandatory, and I want to emphasize that, mandatory veiling and gender segregation jeopardize everyone's social well-being. So we're back to la ikrah fi din, no coercion in religion. Second, study texts, regardless of whether they're scriptural texts, your constitution, texts, they demand literacy, not just to be able to decipher words, but demand a critical theoretical literacy. Because it is only if you have these credentials, which Nawal had in spades, that you can challenge these interpretations and cite relevant passages. And I was just going to quickly mention that I was with Nawal in Morocco. It was 2 years after she had come to Duke, and we went to a conference together. We're in a hotel. There's a big table with all these guys, and they're all, you know, the very distinctive beard and the short jalaba, and you just knew that they were brothers, Muslim brothers. Now, these were the guys who put her on their death list. So she's like, what are these guys doing? And I'm like, no, please, let's just go. And she's like, no. So she goes over to the table and she goes, what are you guys doing here? And they say, it's a conference. Oh, no women? Oh yeah, the women are at that other hotel. I'd like to talk to the women. So I'm like carrying behind her. And they say, well, I don't know. And she looks at one guy. You're the guy. And she goes, Ahmed, my old friend from our communist days. And this was really interesting because that was a move that a number of Egyptians, in particular, in the middle of the 20th century, they moved from being radical leftist Marxists to becoming Muslim brothers. So he had been sitting like this, and he thought, oh, no, wow. So anyway, she got what she wanted. So she drags me over to the other hotel. We come in and it's packed. All the women are sitting in a kind of auditorium. And at the stage where the two of us are to sit are these three guys. And she's like, what are you doing here? So they're like, no, just want to make sure everything is going well. And so she starts to talk to the women, and then the men start to interfere. And it's like, no, this isn't correct from the Quran. She then cites back to them chapter and verse, and they start to get very, very agitated. And finally, she did allow me to drag her out because I'm like, no, we really have to go because it was getting very unpleasant. So anyway, when we went out, I said, why are you doing this? Because, these guys are dangerous. She said, Miriam, she always called me, Miriam, you must know that if I can convert one of these women, just one, to understanding the ways in which they are being abused because they don't know their scriptures, it'll have been worth it. So number 3, advertise the price society pays for physical and epistemic violence against women. 4, establish organizations to coordinate strategies to combat intersectional discriminations and to criminalize so-called crimes of honor. I haven't talked about it today, but that's a whole issue. In America, maybe we don't call it crimes of honor, but we certainly call it, marital murder. And it's happening every single day. And I think it's happening everywhere in the world. But there was this move, particularly in Jordan, to say, well, it's a crime of honor, and yeah, he should be rapped on the knuckles, but not actually punished. 5, resist state-condoned structural inequalities that hurt men and women alike. This really cuts across men and women. Embrace and reward women's ways of fighting. Now, fighting isn't just the anti-colonial fighting or the Arab Spring that I've talked about, but it is ways in which some of the most Islamist women have used jihad as struggle, fight, to empower themselves. And then finally, demand respect for women, for women's rights to live as they wish, including veiling. So if they want to veil, let them. So, thank you.